Bad jokes aside. So before we even start this talk, I'm going to say what was the motivation behind it. So basically, for the last year and a half, I have been working on a project, which I'm not still going to mention. And I have talked to a lot of dApp developers, protocol developers, and basically a lot of people working in the blockchain ecosystem. And we started talking about monitoring. And again, I'm going to come back to that later as well, what monitoring actually is. But talking to them, almost no one either heard of it or they're not even using it. Now, with the expense of the DeFi ecosystem and stuff like the Fulcrum attack and everything else happening, there is a huge demand for monitoring and metrics so we don't fuck things up and then screw the whole system and users' money. So first of all, hello everyone, my name is Bogdan. I'm one of the developers and a co-founder working on Tenderly, and Tenderly is a blockchain monitoring and alerting platform where you basically import your smart contracts and then you get all of these nice metrics and development tools, which we might see later on. Anywho, so the title of this talk is Fantastic Metrics and Where to Find Them. And usually coming up with a title this good takes more time than actually preparing the whole presentation. So today we're going to cover basically 3 topics. The first one is what is monitoring. The second one is when to start monitoring. And the third one is monitoring dApps and protocols themselves. So starting with the first one, this is like the usual Wikipedia thing that you see. So monitoring is tools and processes by which you measure and manage your IT systems. This basically tells us nothing. It's just a really nice extract you can read on Google when you search. But how I like to see monitoring is you have some metrics which are generated by your system. And by system, it can be your dApp, it can be your protocol, it can be your front-end application, whatever. And transferring those metrics in something the business can use. So here we can see 2 things, the business and the system. Now, by a raise of hands, how many of you describe themselves as a business person in your team? Okay, now I'm going to try and ask everyone to raise their hand and say that the correct answer is everyone here. You are a developer, but you're not doing it just for the fun of it. You're being paid for actually bringing the business some value. So from the business perspective, metrics for monitoring are user experience data. Now, what do we mean by user experience data? By user experience data, we mean stuff like, let's say, for example, I'm pro-proc proof of work, which I'm not. And if I put it on the top of my website, do I have more users coming or not? It is used for product decisions. So if I have more users coming in, does that mean that I should actually invest in my team pushing that forward? Of course, the answer is no, but that's another discussion totally. And then from a systems perspective, and by systems perspective, I mean developers, designers, and everyone else that's actually building out the product themselves, it's the state of the system. So if you're making a blockchain game, for example, this can be number of games that are ongoing, or let's say if you're doing like a loans thing, number of loans that defaulted, for example, or stuff like that. The next one is used for detecting problems. Now, a lot of developers actually use monitoring in some way. You have some logs that are screaming, you receive an email, something isn't working, and then you go to your logs and see that there's something actually happening. And then finally, you maybe use those logs, you, God forbid, SSH into something, or go to EtherScan and diagnose and resolve all of the faults that are happening. So that's what monitoring is. But what most people get wrong is when to actually start monitoring. And it's actually really well perceived through a system called the 3 levels of monitoring. So basically, we have 3 levels of monitoring. We have the manual one, and we'll cover each one of them. We have the reactive one, and finally, we have the proactive one. Now, while I'm describing all 3 of these, keep in mind that around 10% of the teams use the manual method, about 60% of teams use the reactive method, and then finally 20% of people use the proactive method. And then try to find where you actually fall. So the manual method is we check things periodically. So I don't know if you guys ever did this, but for example, you wake up, open up EtherScan, and see how many transactions failed for your contract. And this is, oh, okay, something isn't working. In the last 8 hours, there was 20 transactions that failed. They shouldn't have, and then you need to check it. And this is horrendous. By the way, this is a talk where you should feel guilty while listening to. Then the second one is the user lets us know something isn't working. And I can explain this one in an anecdote. The previous company I worked with had the ticketing system for the help desk. And after about 8 hours, people actually started screaming on Twitter that we're not answering their tickets. And for the whole day, we thought, oh my God, everything is working, everyone's happy, nobody's sending in tickets. But actually, the ticketing system itself wasn't working. And then finally, it is usually added after a failure. So after we discovered that the ticketing system wasn't working, then we added like a check that's actually going to, I don't know, send an email every 1 hour and check if that email was received. So this is bad. The second one, which is mostly used, is the reactive method. So it's based on simple thresholds. In normal Web 2.0 development, it can be, for example, your CPO is over 60%, or in dApp development, the one that I mentioned for a failed transaction, it can say, okay, if more than 10 transactions fail per hour, send me an email and I'll check if something's wrong. The second one is, there's some movement towards using that to measure customer experience. So we know that the customers don't like when something isn't working, so we're using it to fix it in that way. But also, for example, you can say, okay, I have this new version of the contract, and the best way actually to explain it, when Maker was moving from SI to DAI, they could have used the number of migrations from SI to DAI and see if people are actually moving their funds there. So that's using the metrics for customer experience. Then updates tend to be reactive in response to incidents and outages. So here we still have a problem that we might put something in place, but we're only going to change it if we see it fail. So it's usually one of those things, don't touch it if it works. And then finally, the last step, it's the last step in application development. So you don't do it from day one. It's you finished up your app, you're done coding, you even maybe deploy to mainnet, you have new users, and then you think, okay, something might actually break. I might put something in place. So this is like 60% of teams use this approach. And then finally, we have the proactive one, which is the correct way. So it's a thing where your metrics are the core of your business, but also of your infrastructure. And that's why I said everybody should raise their hands when I said business. They also focus on measuring application performance and business outcomes. So as I mentioned, let's say you have a new version of your contract. So a business outcome is for all of your users to migrate to that new version. So it's not a technical thing, it's a social thing, it's a business thing, so you see that the new contract is bringing much more value. There is a focus of measuring quality of service and customer experience. So even while you're developing an app, so you're a developer, a hardcode developer, you use Vim, you write Solidity, you compile the code yourself, you deploy it yourself to Web3, you still need to think about how each line of code affects the customer experience and the quality of service. And then finally, and this one is the most important, products will not be considered feature complete or shouldn't be deployed before metrics are added. And this is like the thing that should guilt trip you the most. So without having anything in place, and for smart contract, this is also auditing stuff, this is like external checks, you should do all of this before deploying stuff. We're spending other people's money, not our own. And then basically, let's go through what monitoring means for dApps and protocols. And now, because my computer couldn't be connected, I'm going to try doing this one by one, and it will probably fail at some point. So the first one and the usual one, and the easiest one, is gas usage. So basically, because unfortunately PDFs cannot play movies, let's hope this works. Of course. Here we go. So basically gas usage. You can take a transaction and see how much gas your transaction uses. You can deep dive into it and actually see which function uses the most gas. That's the first thing you can track, for example. Now just to discover how you exit this thing. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, so next thing is optimization comparison. Let's say I'm working on a new version of my smart contract. I want to see how it's performing against another version of the same smart contract. Just a second to see where it is actually. Yeah, here we go. Anywho, I can take the two versions. I can do, for example, average gas used in the last 7 days and compare how much gas each of those contracts used, and I can see if the things I worked on the new version is actually optimized, or even if it uses more gas and I should deploy back to the old version. The next one is protocol version comparison. And this is actually really interesting for protocols. The 0x protocol, for example, I think in December moved from version 2 to version 3. But because here we go, they cannot do like an instant transition, you could actually check how much of the protocol is used of each version. Sorry. So here we can see, for example, that the version 2 of the protocol still has more usage than version 3. So not all users have actually migrated to the new version of the 0x protocol. The next one is incentive comparison, for example. So because we're working in an incentive system, you could actually check if your incentive mechanisms are good or in place. Here, I actually checked if the 0x version 3 protocol gives more incentive to relayers to relay fill orders. And here we can see that actually, when relayers move to version 3, they stay there. They stop providing version 2 support. So the incentive is probably fine. Emitted events, this is also one that's really easy to track. So you could literally look at all of your contracts, and I think this is also the 0x protocol because it's really nice to show. And you can see which contract emits how many events per day, for example. And then we can see, okay, this contract is used much more than the other ones. Maybe I should optimize it. Or this contract is used much more. Here we see WEF, but for example, the exchange one is the entry point to the 0x system. It's really used. Maybe we should optimize there. Maybe we should make it easier for other smart contracts to be used. Again, for emitted events, you could also see, just a second, you could basically also see top events, so per event usage, and then you can have outlier detection, or you can, for example, see each event when it's fired. We can see there's a lot of this wasn't withdrawals, but we have a lot of, it's much easier on the, a lot of transfers, for example, inside the protocol itself. Function calls as well, and I find this one really fun to use. So basically, you see how each function, even internal ones, is called per transaction in I don't know, a period of 7 days. Again, really good to find a place for optimizing, really good to see what people are calling and which parts of your protocol or smart contract systems other people are using, or your DApp. Outlier detection. So here, for example, we can see each address how much is calling our smart contracts. And then we can see, for example, someone trying to game our system. So somebody's saying thousands of transactions more than some other addresses. So here we can see a couple of addresses sending 3 or 4 transactions in 7 days. But then we have one that's sending 1,400 transactions. So it's probably trying either to do something or it's playing a really important part in our system. But we can see that we don't have to check it ourselves, basically. So, and I don't know how to full screen this, I don't know French. So basically, what I want you to take away from this is monitor from day one. So when you open up your Solidity file and start writing, instantly start thinking about how this can be used, how this can be monitored, what are the metrics, what do I care about? Thank you. Thanks. I needed a translator, not an AV guy, but this was good as well. So basically, so monitor from day one. The second one is monitor both business and technical metrics. All of us here are on the business side of things, not the technical side of things. The technical side of things is a really, really, really bad thing that has to happen to actually generate some value. The business is what it's actually important, where the things are important. And then finally, the most important one is be proactive, not reactive. So thank you. If anybody has any questions, my name was Bogdan. I work at Tenderly. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Does anybody in the audience would like to ask any question? You can raise your hand. Lovely. Thank you. It's all yours.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Maybe everybody's afraid of asking questions, but I think like everything you said is like true, but it's also like maximalism kind of true, right? Like of course we should have 100% coverage in our tests, and of course we should have everything monitored from the get-go, and of course we should have enough money to have like the big offices for all our engineers. But this is the real world. So like how do you react? Like what's like the trade-offs you actually do in the actual field to get things done?
Okay, so as I mentioned, the reactive approach is like 60% of the teams, and that's what usually engineering things can do. And this is the same type of talk as you have like with test-driven development, where the guy comes there and say, before even writing 50,000 lines of code for your application, you should write 1.5 million lines of test code from your head and then just make those tests pass. If this talk was open up Etherscan every other morning or every morning, usually people would go home and open it like once per week. So I have to go the maximalist approach. And then people, if they take half of it this home, it would be great. In the real world, the majority of things, especially now, unfortunately, and I'm really scared about this in the blockchain ecosystem, is when things go wrong, then people put stuff in place for it to actually like not happen again. That's the wrong approach. What I would do, for example, and what I actually do while developing, is for the most mission-critical parts of the system, everything is in place from day one. So even before deploying, everything is in place. But for less mission-critical stuff, so for example, I don't know, checking your balance or whatever, I will probably add the metric there if it's working, or alert if it's working only once it fails. So in the real world, it's basically a balance of, okay, this can like create a lot of damage if it's not working, or okay, I really want to know if this is bringing the value to the business. But if it's not that important, I probably won't monitor it until it fails. So that's the reactive approach, I guess.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Does anybody else would like to ask any other question? No. Don't be shy. Nice. All right. So thank you very much for coming. Give it up for Bogdan.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks.
Sorry. And yeah, have a wonderful day. Thank you very much, man. Sorry for the...
No, it's
I know it was a mess. Where did I leave my phone?